Hi everyone, my name is Alexander Zalivako, and I'm the founder of From A to Z law firm. One of the areas of our expertise are sanctions, and in a series of presentations called Sanctions 360 Degrees, we will look into major sanctions economic regimes and the way they affect the lives of private individuals and corporations. Thank you very much for watching.
We will look in today's presentation into a practical example of how sanctions can affect day-to-day life of private individuals. And we will do so by looking at the example which may affect many individuals which have nothing to do with the war of Russia and Ukraine, namely Russian tourists who would like to visit the European Union countries, and the new rules which the EU introduced in connection with the issue of multi-entry visas early in November. And we would do so by looking into the following 4 points. We would briefly touch upon the legal framework of the European Union, which sets out the rules for the issue of visas. Then we will discuss the key principles of those regimes, the categories of people who may take advantage of them. Then we would briefly look into the developments in the visa policy of the European Union with respect to Russian citizens started from 2022. And we would put this into the context of the new implementing decision issued by the European Commission on the 6th of November and discuss in more detail the practical consequences of that decision. On this slide, I set out the key legal documents which set out the current regime with respect to the issue of the EU visas. These are two codes, the Visa Code and the Schengen Border Code, which sets out the requirements and the principles which would be used by the consulates of the European Union member states for the purpose of issue of visas. It has to be noted that the visa policy is in the joint competence of both the European Union and the member states. At the European Union level, the two codes regulate this policy in quite detail, and the member states have the ultimate discretion as to the issue or refusal to issue the visas. There is a very helpful Visa Code handbook issued by the European Commission, which sets out various practical examples when and how the visas shall be issued. And this is useful for the purpose of applying the law set out in both codes with respect to day-to-day situations of the applicants. This is something which we will discuss more in this presentation. This is what is a general visa regime of the European Union. So those persons who are visiting the European Union on business, for tourist purposes, or for short-term visits of their relatives will use the framework of this regime. And then there is a separate framework which relates to so-called family reunification purposes, which require that a European Union citizen is reunifying with some members of his or her family living outside of the European Union. And that regime separately and more extensively regulates the persons who are entering the European Union on reunification basis to get an entry visa. And again, we have the relevant regulations which set out the principles, as well as the Commission's guidance, which gives practical, detailed examples of how those principles shall be applied. So as I already mentioned, the current visa regimes can be broadly subdivided into two broad groups, and one group has two subcategories. The first is so-called reunification visa regime, when in essence an EU national, that would be one of the conditions for this regime to apply, wants to reunify with the part of his or her family who are not EU nationals. And those members of the family can be a part of so-called core family of an EU national when they have a right to get into the European Union and to be issued the visa. So that's a right, which in principle cannot be restricted. And this core family will include the spouse, registered partners, direct descendants under 21, and dependent descendants. So the most flexible regime will apply to this group of people. And a subcategory of the reunification visa issue regime applies to so-called extended family, where a broader category of persons are covered, but the rule is that the member states shall facilitate the issue of visas, so there is no right as such to get a visa. And then the third regime, which will be the core of this presentation, relates to all other circumstances when a person wants to visit the European Union, either, for example, because a relative who is not a national of the European Union is living there, or a national, but the visit is not for reunification purposes, or what is more common, there are no relatives or family members living in the European Union, but a person is just visiting the European Union for personal needs like tourism, business purposes, or participation in some conferences, this type of visits. So it has to be noted that the recent developments is not something new. In essence, since the beginning of 2022, the European Commission has consistently took the view that the issue of visas to the Russian nationals needs to be limited. So it has been one of the policies of the European Commission basically since the termination, since the suspension of the agreement between the European Union and Russian Federation on the facilitation of the issue of visas. And in principle, already late 2022, various recommendations were issued to the member states, which purpose was in essence to limit the issue of visas to the Russian nationals. And in particular, it was recommended that the multi-entry visas should not be issued. In addition to this policy of the European Commission, certainly various member states took their own view on the immigration policies and restricted or almost prohibited the issue of visas to Russian nationals. One of the examples which I would like to mention is specifically the right of Russian nationals to apply for a visa outside of Russia. In accordance with Article 6 of the Visa Code, two principles apply where a person can go to a consulate and file an application. First principle, which is the core, is that this shall be the place where a person legally resides, which implies a permanent residency in a place on the basis of a passport or residence permit. And the second category is where a person is legally present, which implies that he or she has a right to be present in the country, for example, on the basis of the visa, or arguably short-term residence permit. But it's not what is his or her habitual place of residence. Very clearly, following 2022, especially the mobilization in Russia, many persons left Russia to the neighboring countries, which they were able to enter without a visa, at least on a short-term basis. And then those persons, for various personal reasons, wanted to apply to the consulates of the European Union located in those countries to visit the European Union. So the Commission took a conservative and prohibitive view towards this type of applications, in essence advising not to issue visas outside of Russia, being very clear these applicants will not go back to Russia to apply for the EU visa there. So in essence, the recommendation was not to issue visas at all in case of some extraordinary circumstances like the sickness of a close family member. So we see that the approach has been restrictive already for about 3 years. It's important to put this restrictive approach into the context. so that we understand the factual matters. As of August 2024, there are approximately 500,000 of Russian citizens with a Schengen visa out of more than 140 million the population of Russia. So we talk about a very, very small number of people who have a visa. And 75% of those Russian nationals receive the visa for tourist purposes. So very clearly, we talk about a category of people who are just coming to the European Union for holiday vacations or other tourist purposes. Seems to be unlikely that this type of people will engage into the subversion activity, so will become a burden on the European welfare state. The statistics of the visas is also interesting. We see that more than half of those visas were actually multi-entry visas, although for a short period of time, less 1 year. Very infrequently, visas exceeding this 1 year period were issued, so that was a rarity. And then 1/3 of the visas were one-entry visas. We can also see that the number of denials of visas has substantially increased over a period of the last 3 years, which again is largely explained due to the policy of certain member states to stop issuing visas at all. So presumably in some member states, the denial rates are over 50%, which is supported by the last bullet on the slide, which means that there is a substantial divergence between the way different member states approach the visa policy towards Russian nationals. We see that the denial rates differ substantially between various member states, as well as the rate of issue of visas, with those European member states which heavily depend on tourism from Russia continuing to issue visas to Russian citizens, whereas those member states which are not that dependent on tourism in terms of the national economy refuse to issue visas at all. So overall, the trend has already been towards a reduced number of visas issued to Russian nationals. The focus was shifting towards the single entry visas, but we can also see a substantial disparity between the member states, and it's presumably this disparity which Commission decided to rectify beginning of November with a new implementing decision issued on the 6th of November 2025, where Commission quoted various regulatory and security risks resulting from weaponization of migration, acts of sabotage in the Baltic Sea, cyber-industrial threats, and promoting propaganda and subversive activities, recommended to member states, now in obligatory form, to, in essence, deny Russian nationals applying in Russia from multi-entry visas. Again, putting this into context of 75% of those applying for visas being tourists, it seems that the real problem here is not that much that these tourists are engaged in the acts of sabotage in the Baltic Sea or propaganda type of activities, but more that the Commission is worried about disparity in how visa is treated by various member states in the European Union. So now we would look into the practical implications of these recent measures. The first point, which is important to note, is that they do not affect two family reunification visa regimes, which we've just discussed. They remain untouched, and in essence, the same principles apply. To the extent the visa is required for family reunification purposes, it shall be granted as of right to co-family members, and it should be facilitated for extended family members. So the changes relate to the Schengen visa codes regimes. Second point to note is that to the extent Russians apply outside of Russia, so for example, a Russian citizen is now legally present in Armenia or Kazakhstan, then the application for multi-entry visa can be filed there. And in principle, the restrictions do not apply such type of applications, but it's unlikely that the visas will be granted in the circumstances for the reasons we've discussed at the beginning of the presentation, that already beginning 2022, Commission recommended to restrict Russian nationals from applying in the countries where they legally present and not legally reside, in essence, outside of Russia. So this option remains available, but in essence, it seems unlikely that it will be widely used. And then certainly existing visas are not affected by the regime. Now, who is affected? In general, it seems that there's more discussion of this new measure than the measure itself, because although the measure recommends not to issue multi-entry visas to the Russian nationals, it maintains the general carve-out of those visas may be issued to the extent the relevant applicant proves the need to travel frequently to the European Union and cure his integrity and reliability, which in essence was the criteria for the issue of a multi-entry visa even before the recent measures came in place. It's true that in the recitals towards the implementing decision, the Commission mentioned that the relevant categories where this should apply to relate to the vulnerable groups of persons, like human rights activists, dissidents, journalists, rather than to a general category of Russian citizens. Nevertheless, the criteria remains what it is, and to the extent the relevant multi-entry visa is justified given the specific circumstance of a person, certainly he is advised to appeal to that criteria being still available. And then two separate groups of persons are specifically excluded from this general prohibition: the close relatives of the persons who are residing in the European Union, subject to this person being in possession of visas during the previous 2 years, or visas were issued to such a person, and the transport workers, again subject to the receipt of 2 visas during the previous 2 years. And in both of those circumstances, the period for which the visa is issued is recommended to be 1 year and 9 months. But this is consistent with the current practice of, as we saw, more than 60% of the visas being issued for a period not exceeding 1 year, and combined with single entry visas, more than 90% of the visas been issued for a period not exceeding 1 year, and in exceptional circumstances, we saw that the 2 or longer period visas are issued. So all in all, it seems that certainly the measure will not make cooperation between ordinary Russians and non-honorary citizens of the European Union easier. The connections will become more difficult, and that's a trend which we saw, including the 19th sanctions package, when the tourist services were included among the prohibited services within the territory of the European Union to the extent they advertise travels to Russia. So we see with this example one more time how international economic sanctions affect not just those who are directly involved in the actions and in the policies which the sanctions try to change, but also common people who very often have nothing to do with those policies. Thank you very much for watching. I trust that you found this presentation useful, and I hope you see me during my next presentations.